Thank you all for coming. I love this subject. So,
Okay. Too many buttons.
it's going to work. It did a minute ago.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, as you know, we're very close to celebrating the November 11th Armistice Day, so it's appropriate to look at this subject in November. And as a theater historian, I'm interested in what happened in theater during the war. And I'm focusing particularly on French and Americans, the closest collaborators, best friends. Right after the war began in 1914, everything changed in Paris. It had been a time of frivolity, the Belle Epoque, lots of theater, can, I mean, all those things. And suddenly theaters closed everywhere. All theaters closed. Theater people were mobilized as well as anybody else. But gradually, theater did reopen, but they imposed a tax, a surtax on ticket prices to help fund the war. So and in the streets, very quickly, this is what you began to see people who had been wounded in war and little children playing war games on the street. Americans were neutral at the time for a couple of years and could not do anything official, but a lot of educated young men wanted to volunteer, and they left their studies, many of them from Harvard and Yale, and went to France as volunteers on their own, and many of them became ambulance drivers. There are a lot of stories and poems about that experience, and some theater people were involved. I would particularly signal Gilbert Emery, who was a playwright, quite successful playwright, eight plays on Broadway in his career, and then he mostly went on and became a Hollywood film actor with about 80 films. Maybe the one you would recognize is A Farewell to Arms. This is his most famous Broadway play, and it is about the aftermath of the war, an American soldier coming home after having served in France. Another example of Americans volunteering before we were actively involved in the war was, of course, the famous Lafayette Escadrille, American flyers who were daredevil young men who went and fought planes. And there have been feature films about them. They had a pet lion. So the famous, named after, of course, the Marquis de Lafayette, one of the greatest friends our country ever had in France. So the United States remained neutral until April of 1917, but there were things that could be done on the side. And there were a lot of women journalists who went over. So I'm just going to look at one in particular who had a theater connection, and then another one I'll mention. But you may have heard of Mary Roberts Reinhardt. She was known as a mystery novelist. She also wrote for Saturday Evening Post and other magazines. Very, very successful writer. She had four sons, so she was a mother and a journalist. And she her magazine paid her to go and report the war in the very early days. She actually met the King and Queen of Belgium, devastated Belgium. And these are photographs from her memoir. Actually, she wrote several books on the subject, but one of them is called My Story, about the wounded that she met. And the other journalist who went was playwright Sophie Treadwell. You might know her name because she wrote a play called Machinal or Machinal that the Rep did back in the 1990s. uh, she's most famous for Machinal, but she also went over and did some reporting from the front. Another other famous women who were abroad. Of the three names up there, you might know Elsie de Wolfe, who became a very famous interior decorator and lived a very long life after the war. Her partner originally was Elizabeth Marbury, who was the very first American play agent. A great friend of France, she signed up the leading French playwrights to represent them for the American stage, got them productions in New York and on tour. The French loved her, and she loved the French. And then Anne Morgan, not up there yet, she will be. Well, Marbury and de Wolfe got in the habit of going to France every summer. And eventually they saw this decrepit villa in Versailles for sale They bought it in 1905 and began a long process of restoring it. It's kind of where Elsie de Wolfe really formed her style with the trellises, the green colors, the chintz, light and airy. And so that was an ongoing process every summer that the two of them did. I should mention that Elsie started out as an actress. I'm trying to keep that theater connection going. She So they bought the villa and remodeled it over the years, and they were joined by Anne Morgan, who was and she and Elizabeth Bessie Marbury were a couple for a while. Anne Morgan was the daughter of the great financier J.P. Morgan. She differed from her father. She didn't like the way he spent his money, but she thought was interested in causes and helping people. And so when they soon donated the house to be used as a hospital during the war. This beautiful, beautiful home. Of course, they got it back afterwards and remodeled it and fixed it up again. But so Elizabeth Marbury was joined the Knights of Columbus. She had converted to Catholicism and did her good work through that channel. She went back to her work as an agent, a playwright's agent, and also began producing plays. People don't know that the very successful Princess Musicals series that launched the career of Jerome Kern, among other, P.G. Woodhouse, that group, plays a very good Eddie and Nobody Home, the really famous princess musicals. They were Bessie Marbury's idea. She was the very first one to think of doing intimate musicals. And of course, it was a way of giving Elsie a job. She got Elsie de Wolfe to design the scenery. Uh, so she was doing that in New York and also raising money for to send to France. Um, Her offices were located in the Empire Theater building, which was owned by the beloved theater producer Charles Frohman. Frohman was the most successful. He had originally been with the Theatrical Syndicate as an independent producer. He had offices and did productions in New York and London, perhaps most famously Peter Pan. If you saw that movie, Dustin Hoffman played Charles Frohman. Uh, uh, and he was going to London on the Lusitania when it was torpedoed, and the news was just devastating. In fact, May 7th, 1915, it just happened that the beautiful Maud Adams was performing in Kansas City at 7th and Walnut, the grand uh, theater there, and she got the news right before she was supposed to go on, and she just didn't think she could do it. But our Abraham Judah, the manager of that theater, said, "What would Frohman want you to do? Would he want you to weep in a corner or do the show?" She did the show. Elsie de Wolfe started as an actress. She acted in Charles Frohman's Empire Theater Stock Company, but she discovered herself with Bessie Marbury's coaching because Bessie could see her getting restless and was afraid she would lose her hold on Elsie. So Bessie found the right profession for Elsie, and that was interior decoration. Bessie got her a job decorating the Colony Club in New York, which put Elsie on the map as a decorator, and then also the scene design jobs. But during the war, Elsie wouldn't stay in New York with Bessie. She went back to France and became a nurse with the Ambrine unit. Ambrine was a discovery of how to help soldiers who had been gassed, and it kind of saved their skin. So she did that. She wrote vividly about it in her memoir about being under fire from bombardments and evacuating, and also just constantly ministering to the disfigured soldiers. Yes.
What is ambrine?
It's a kind of chemical that could be kind of like a Vaseline, I guess, as far as I understand it, that they would apply to the skin so that the skin wouldn't fall off after they were gassed. So she was very much recognized by the French Legion of Honor. Bessie coveted also that kind of recognition from the French government, and the French wanted to give it to her, but J.P. Morgan thought that Bessie was the one who had turned Anne Morgan into a lesbian, and so he was powerful enough to prevent Bessie Marbury from ever getting the Legion of Honor or the Croix de Guerre. But Anne Morgan went on to find another partner, Anne Murray Dyke, and they formed the Committee for the Devastated Regions of France and did all kinds of good works in it was up near Normandy, which was, the most difficult area of incursions and bombardment and destroyed villages. And so they had women who came and volunteered to work with them. They had a headquarters there at a town called Blérancourt, and they managed to get ambulances. So they did medical work, and just mainly they focused on women and children because all the men were off fighting, and the women and children having to kind of go it alone and find food. And so Anne Morgan's committee did a lot. And you notice the book up here is just out, Miss Morgan's Book Brigade. It was also about keeping education going for the little French children and just bringing library books. I mean, cartons and cartons of books to give away to keep up the morale. That's really a good novel about it. Okay, more than you want to know about Jacques Copeau. He was a Frenchman, quite an ego, I must say, he'd been a critic and a playwright, but he founded a theater called the Vieux Colombier in 1913. It had a great first season, and then the war broke out, and suddenly his whole company was recruited. All the men in the company were mobilized. And so he couldn't have a second season. He tried to enlist, but he was too old and not in good physical condition. So he went off and, he met Edward Gordon Craig and Appia, things like that. But the French government said, why don't you go to New York and just make the French look good to the Americans so that eventually they'll help us out, even though, and give up their neutrality. So he thought he would get to take his actors to New York, but he couldn't. They were all in different units all over the country. So he went alone in January 1917, and what a shock. I mean, New York was so different from France. But luckily he met the right person, Otto Kahn, a millionaire who loved French culture and wanted to help out. So Otto Kahn was bankrolling a lot of artists. But he met with Copeau and was very impressed. Copeau was also impressed with what he saw of the small independent theaters of the 1910s. There were several of them in New York. It had started with Provincetown Players and a couple of others. So, and he found wealthy people who could rally their friends to come and see the plays at that first season. And I should mention Rita de Leiding was the sister of the famous Mercedes de Acosta, if that means anything. So Otto Kahn wanted he wanted Copeau to run an existing French theater in New York, French language theater. But and Copeau thought this is a great idea because it would be a way to get the French government to release his actors and let them come to America. So he decided to do that, but he said he wanted to keep his own company name, Théâtre du Vieux Colombier. Well, Otto Kahn, Copeau turned out to be a money pit, but luckily Otto Kahn kept it going, and they remodeled this small Garrick theater for the Théâtre. Oh, I'm sorry, I hit the wrong one. You warned me. Oh, thank you. So Copeau went back to France. He went back to France for the summer, and gradually his men were released from their military duties. He got costumers. They built hundreds of costumes over the summer, and Copeau wrote a letter. I see my work in the USA as a mission, not a business. He was determined not to be commercially successful. He was an artist. He was above all that. And then they didn't have boats. to get the company over to New York. All the boats were being used for the military, so they had to wait. But Coupeau gave lectures while he was waiting, and again, you see this quotation: how he's not going to make any concessions to American taste. He's going to make Americans learn to love French taste. And then so they did finally arrive in New York in November 1917, and did shows. They were big on Moliere and big on minimalist theater, like the little theaters of the time. Not much scenery, just all focus on the actor's body and the playwright's words. Sorry. Okay. Well, Otto Kahn, people started complaining to Otto Kahn, what are you're spending your money on this artsy stuff? And and so Kahn went to Coupeau and had a friendly talk. Can't you be a little bit more commercial? Make a little compromise. And Coupeau, I do not compromise my art. But Kahn continued supporting him, and even lent his country estate for the Colombier artists to spend the summer rehearsing and preparing their next season of plays. And so that's where they lived. They had a regimen of exercises every morning, rehearsals, and building their scenery in the billiards room. And the food rationing had begun in the United States, so they were always hungry. And then they did do a second season in New York, but that was it. Then home. After when the war ended, they were all eager to get home. And the news from France while they were performing was devastating, because this was when Big Bertha began shelling Paris, and there was a lot of horrible destruction. It was a and the German army was getting very close to Paris. One of the American woman who observed the advance of the German army onto the Marne was Mildred Aldrich. She was an American journalist, critic. I have a complete set, I don't know, about 10 of her writings in little green books. And a couple of them are specifically about watching the war from her hilltop over the Marne. And she wrote it all up, and there's her house. And they had down in the valley with the French soldiers did soldier theatricals to keep up their morale. She attended those and describes those in her books. So she also was friendly with Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. And here's a sample of one of her letters to them. There they are. When war broke out, they originally fled to Spain, but then they came out to help the cause. And they were active all through the war. Then after that, Gertrude Stein bought a car, a flivver, and learned to drive. And so they did ambulance work. They delivered supplies together. There you see their little Ford with a Red Cross cover, delivering Red Cross supplies. And Sarah Bernhardt is a whole separate story. Of course, I have major PowerPoints on her and what she did during the war, both in France and America. She's, of course, very famous, the most famous. She had served the French cause during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870s. And then in 1905, she had been playing Tosca. And Tosca has to jump from a parapet, and someone forgot to put the mattress down there. This was on tour in South America. And so she had a painful knee for about 10 years. She acted through the pain. And finally, in 1915, it was starting to be gangrenous, and so she had to have the leg amputated. In 1915, all the doctors were at the front. But the one place they could find a doctor was Bordeaux, because the French government had moved to Bordeaux. So she went to Bordeaux. They wheeled her into the operating room. She was singing the Marseillaise as they wheeled her in. And then from then on, she was a one-legged actress. Meanwhile, the Germans were getting closer. I mean, it was in and out, of course, with the trench warfare, but they bombing the Cathedral of Reims. She later made a movie there. I guess I jumped ahead of my slides here. But her return to the stage, the amputation was it February, and then she was back on stage in November. It was a show in Paris called The Cathedrals, and each actress represented a cathedral of France. And she was the one seated down in front. And as she finished her monologue, or what during her monologue, she rose up on her one leg. It was amazing. Can you imagine? Um, and I mean, she was so powerful. Well, she also participated briefly in the Théâtre aux Armées. This was French, a French unit, theatrical sent to the front to boost the morale of the French soldiers. So they would go in small units and just do performances of something upbeat to keep the soldiers happy. French soldiers were called poilus, hairy ones. So there's an example of the Théâtre aux Armées, theater on the front lines, and all sorts of formats with little portable stages. And Sarah Bernhardt went out to perform in the Théâtre aux Armées in May of 1916. She never used crutches ever. And she never had a wooden leg. She tried on a wooden leg. It had leather straps around the waist and it would spin. And so she just decided she threw it away. She never used it. It was more elegant to be carried in a sedan chair. And when she was on stage, she was just hold on to the furniture. Also, she was very strong. She could hop on one leg, or she could hop from one furniture piece to the next. Well, there she is, and seated in front of one of those little stages. But since she was a national treasure, the Germans wanted to kidnap her, and the French decided they better get her out of the country to keep her safe. And so they would send her to America during the war to keep her so she would not get kidnapped. But and also it was a subtle form of propaganda because they still wanted the Americans to join on the side of the Allies. So, but she was admonished, you must not do any patriotic speeches because you have to respect American neutrality. And there are a lot of German Americans. You just have to be respectful. So she just had to be really, really careful giving interviews for the first year of her tour. And finally, once the United States joined the war, she started speaking out and saying, what she thought of those Huns. She always performed in French, and she had a couple of one-act plays specially written for her American tour, among her other set pieces. She was in her 60s by now, still playing 19-year-old Joan of Arc, and proud of it. In fact, there's a line in her Joan of Arc play when the judge would say, "How old are you?" And Sarah Bernhardt would turn to the audience, 19. And, anyway, one of her plays was Star in the Night, and they would sell, these are the translations they would sell to the audience so they could follow along or read them in advance. This is Star in the Night when the husband comes home blinded from the gas, and the lines are very strong. Ils passeront pas, they shall not pass, was one of the slogans of the war. And this is fun to hear the French view of Americans. This is a line from the play about those crazy Americans, good old boys. And then another play was From the Stage to the Field of Honor. It was about a French soldier who wakes up wounded. And this was good for Bernhardt because she could play it all lying down at the roots of a tree. She didn't have to get up at all because her leg was wounded. I mean, the soldier character's leg was wounded. And she's worried about, well, why am I here? Have I lost the flag? I need to find the flag. And so it's mostly a monologue, anger at the Huns, and finally visited by a Red Cross nurse, and then her dying words, "Long live France, vive la France." Back in the United States, we are in the United States. There was a play that opened on Broadway right before we declared war, and that was called Over There, written by J. Hartley Manners, who was the husband of Lorette Taylor. I think you know that name. She played Amanda Wingfield in Glass Menagerie 30 years later. But her husband was British, and he wrote this as a vehicle for Lorette Taylor. She played a little Cockney girl, and uh, so this was a great success. It had a good long run, and about a girl who wants to serve her country, but she's held back by class discrimination, and then she shows she is really a hero, a real service to her country in the Red Cross. And then they put together a whole new production of it with an all-star cast, big names from Broadway playing all the different roles in over there, or out there. Even Georgian Cohan in the Irish tenor Chauncey Olcott. All these people were in it. Julia Arthur. So before 1917, the United States didn't have much of an army, and then under President Wilson, it subtly increased just to be ready. And then war was declared in April 1917, and selective service men were recruited and began to be trained. Meanwhile, the French sent over a delegation to rally Americans, and Marshal Joffre and Rene Viviani was the premier. They came to the United States. They were in Chicago, Kansas City, and I think Washington, and they attracted huge crowds in Kansas City. It was very much written up. And then in the Army, they started opening Liberty theaters on the training bases. And this is a nice book about it by Weldon Durham, documenting that whole process of the Army theaters of those 2 years, how they were built and operated, and how the tickets were sold, and what kind of shows they did. Irving Berlin was just getting his career going. He still was not quite naturalized American. He got naturalized American just in time to be drafted, and he was kind of old, but he well, you see, he had money from his hit songs, and one of the first thing he did on a free weekend was go back to New York and get his military uniform remade by a good tailor. He so he was at Camp Upton, which was in upstate New York, I guess a couple hours, I don't know, train ride from New York, Long Island, and that's where they were training in Yaphank, New York, which became part of the title of one of the shows he put together. They decided he could boost morale if he would do what he knew how to do best, which was was show business. And so they asked him to create a soldier show. And so he got an instant promotion so that he would outrank the people he was having to direct in the shows. But it meant he had to, what he hated most was getting up at the call of that bugle, and he wrote his famous song, "Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning," which was recycled again in World War II. And the soldier show was Yip Yip Yap Hank. There's the Liberty Theater at Camp Upton where they first created it. And it was amazing because a lot of Broadway stars came out by train out to Camp Upton to see Irving Berlin's soldier show. In a soldier show, the women's roles are played by men. It's men in drag, but it's playing all the girl roles. So there's one of the song sheets from it. And it was so successful and so morale building that they took it to Broadway. Here you have one of the numbers. Those are all 3 men playing those parts that you see up there. And on Broadway, it was amazing. At the Century Theater, 32 performances. And at the final performance, the cast was all singing and marching down from the stage through the audience out to the street and all the blocks to the dock, where they marched right onto the boat and sailed for France. This was in the air. Goodbye, Broadway. Hello, France. And nobody thought the war would last as long as it did. It took, because there were not enough ships to send all the Americans, there was a lot of waiting and back and forth. So they didn't arrive. I mean, Americans had declared war in April, and the first Americans didn't land in France until June. So it was a long, slow process. And meanwhile, back home, women were asked to help. Many of the American soldiers were first generation immigrants. They were illiterate. The joke was they were taught to line up and stand at attention, and their names were called out, and they were supposed to step forward here. Um, uh, one of the commanding officers sneezed, and some Germans stepped forward. That was a joke at the time. Women, of course, back in France, having to do what the men had always done before they were recruited. And American women wanted to help the French women. Among them was the most successful American playwright of her time, Rachel Crothers. A lot of plays on Broadway through the 10s and 20s. Well, actually, even starting in the 1900s. And so she just took time off from playwriting and decided and founded the women's stage. She gathered a bunch of women, theater women, to decide what could they do, and it was to form the SWWR, a Stage Women's War Relief. This is a very famous poster. You see, I have a copy of it here. And they did all kinds of things like rolling bandages, preserving fruit, making baby clothes, uh, transporting soldiers to the theater, anything you can think of, they did. And they had a mass meeting at the Hudson Theater. And there is Rachel Crothers at her office, and she was really the genius behind it. But all stage women rallied to help. This is the kind of thing that when you get to World War II would turn into the stage door canteens. So this is kind of the preliminary idea for that kind of thing, to keep the soldiers happy when they're um, on break. So they had an office, and women would come in every day and do that kind of thing. One of them was Dorothy Donnelly, who was a librettist, and she was vice president under Rachel Crothers. Later went to France and ran the YMCA entertainment unit there, and various others. Dorothy Donnelly. Elsie Janis is a special case because she didn't wait for anything to be organized. She had enough money. She and her mother could just go to France, and she could just barge into the Red Cross office or YMCA office and say, "I'm here. Give me a vehicle. I'm going to the front to entertain the boys." and she and her mother, with a driver and the dog, would and an accompanist, would go and over the mud roads and wherever the men were near the trenches, and she would entertain. She got the nickname Sweetheart of the American Expeditionary Forces. There was one time, this is written up by Alexander Wolcott in the New York Times, but the men were waiting near one of those places where the trains turn around, and Elsie Janis came in riding on the cowcatcher on the front of the train in a flowing white dress, right up to the end of the line where the men were all standing around. And can you imagine how dangerous that was? But it worked. It was so good. They loved it. So she'd climb on a car wherever she could get an audience. Are we downhearted? No. She would get them to answer in unison. She would get them to join in the songs. She was an amazing personality, and she loved to be photographed with the boys. This was the highlight of her life. I mean, her life was never better than wartime when she was so loved. So back home, celebrities volunteered to sell Liberty bombs. One of them, a favorite of mine, the cowboy star William S. Hart, he did that. on the Liberty Bond drives. And there is William S. Hart with Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford and the female impersonator Julian Eltinge, all planning their Liberty Loan drives. There is, these are all on Wall Street, people watching the stage where they're um, just rallying people to buy Liberty bonds. And Irving Berlin did that. Charlie Chaplin did it. And there's Pickford and Fairbanks. And then Al Jolson, he had songs like Sister Susie's Sewing Shirts for Soldiers, and that became very popular. It was a tongue twister. But not only would he uh, sing songs, but he was the star of a Sigmund Romberg show. But as soon as the show let out, he would head down to the docks and sing all his songs for the boys as they were boarding the ships. He would sing wherever there was an audience with his great big wonderful voice. And this is so poignant. It's supposed to be by a little girl trying to get to her father. You know, one of those wall telephones that maybe every block had one. And the little girl calling, picking up the phone. Hello, Central. Get me no man's land. My daddy's there. I want to hear him. And Jolson singing that with his Jolson voice, and yet, you know, you believed this is the emotion of a little girl wanting to talk to her father. And one night there was a big a benefit at the Century Theater, and the great opera star Enrico Caruso came on first, and he just blew it all away. Big operatic voice. I mean, it was amazing. People were just like, you know, in awe. And then after that, Al Jolson sauntered out and said, "Folks, you ain't heard nothing yet." And it was true. Jolson topped Caruso. And so people did love France. Oh, the castles. Vernon and Irene Castle introduced ballroom dancing to the whole country. Before them, it was not polite to touch the person you were dancing with, certainly not to hold them and with arms around them. And the Castles did it. It was not vulgar. They demonstrated everywhere they could go. And by the way, their agent was Bessie Marbury. She was the one who knew how to launch their careers as family-friendly dancers, even with things like, well, not quite tango, but anyway. So they started the craze for ballroom dancing, and they toured. I'll be saying more about James Reese Europe in a couple minutes. But he was a black orchestra leader, composer, pianist, violinist, and Vernon and Irene Castle toured with him, I think 14 cities, and James Reese Europe, they would never let him be refused service. They gave him equal accommodations on their train, all those things. So there are a lot of anecdotes I don't have time to go into. So they launched the craze, but then Vernon, they were at the peak of their success when Vernon wanted to do the patriotic thing, and he went to Canada, trained as a flyer, and then went to France and flew. And then we was brought back to the States to train American flyers in Texas. And there he is. He was in a dogfight in France. That was his sketch. And then in Texas, and he was on a training flight, and the plane crashed, and he died. Irene Castle went on to have a career in movies. In France, we can't not mention Guillaume Apollinaire, a poet, art critic, and as soon as France war broke out in France, he was not a French citizen, but he was eager to volunteer, and he drove all night to volunteer. And this is an example of his poetry. It was called Calligrams. It was in the shape of something. So this is a poem in the shape of the car he drove in to get to where he could volunteer as a soldier. And then he got a head wound and was invalided out of the war. He was very prolific, endless letters to different women. I mean, whole volumes of letters, one to each woman, that he was stringing along. And but back in Paris, he was back in the theater world, and his most famous work is the play Breasts of Tiresias, that was done in Paris in the middle of the war, when they didn't have any scenery. Everything was made of cardboard, the costumes, the scenery, just whatever they could pull together. They would have one actor saying, "I represent 10,000 people," that kind of thing. And it was, since it was one night only, and they had to close the doors when they reached capacity. So all during the performance, you could hear banging on the doors, people wanting to get in and see this historic evening of theater. So that's another drawing of the kind of comic costumes. And unfortunately, he died right right at the end. He didn't. He wanted to. He was so creative, but he died of the Spanish flu. Maurice Chevalier was getting big time just when the war broke out, and he was in the infantry, wounded, taken prisoner by the Germans. In a way, it was lucky because he was so engaging, so likable, and could make friends with anybody. And one of his fellow French prisoners taught him English well during his 2 years there, and that enabled him to have a bilingual career in France and the United States. So in the 20s, you see, he was very alive. He was a kid, a street kid from the lowest of the low areas of Paris, really poverty-stricken childhood, and had taught himself acrobatics on the pavement, and just all self-taught. And you see that it translated into his stage work. So and then in the States, many African Americans enlisted and had a big influence on music that was done here and over there. Um, and African American women, uh, nurses, they ended up having their own clubs because of discrimination. Uh, but the war effort was just the same. Okay, here's a very important name, James Reese Europe, composer and band leader, and he did everything, classical music. His band played Carnegie Hall twice in 1913, 12, 13, I think. And he enlisted, he volunteered, he wasn't drafted, and he just wanted to fight. He wanted to be a machine gunner, but they got over to France, and all the African Americans were being sent to dig ditches and build railroads and dig reservoirs, and they said, no, we came to fight. And so what they decided, well, if you want to fight, you're going to have to join the French army. We'll send you over and let the French take care of you. And that was the choice: either dig ditches, do the manual labor, or fight with the French. And they didn't want to give up their number. They were the 15th New York, and a low number meant they volunteered early, but they decided they'd rather fight, so they went to the French, and they became the famous 356 Harlem Hellfighters, and they became the fightingest unit of the French army. They served more days under combat. I just so their record was amazing. So and also in his unit was Noble Sissel. I'm sure you've heard of Sissel and Blake. U.B. Blake. I'm just wild about Harry. Well, so Noble Sissel was in the trenches with James Reese Europe. There they are. They had to learn a whole new type of gun, a whole new commands, everything. And they did it, and they excelled. So the 369th, Harlem Hellfighters, and they didn't actually get honored. Well, they did in a way, but they didn't get their medals until Obama became president, and then posthumous medals. Um, so Europe, he was both a fighter, and they wanted his band to tour France to serve to boost morale, and so sometimes he did that, and he got French villages to fall in love with jazz. Um, and he did on a patrol and got gassed, so he had to be in a hospital for a while. And while he was in the hospital, he composed his most famous song, "On Patrol in No Man's Land." And I'm not going to take the time to play it because it's hard to get back to the main point after I switch over to music. But at the end, if you want, we can do it. But that's the word, and they do the sound of shooting in the song. So that's his most famous. Um, and they so they did a lot of playing at hospitals, and there's you'll be Noble Sissel. Luckily, there's a typescript. It's never been published, but you can find the typescript on the online of his whole memoir of what he did over there. And finally, the 369th, they got the French Croix de Guerre, more days of combat than any other unit in the entire war. Okay. And they finally got to go home, and they got a ticker tape parade up Fifth Avenue. Most were down Fifth Avenue, but they got to go up toward Harlem. And they rode, and it was the cheering. But then Americans have short memories. But most of his band wanted to go with him on a tour. And so they did one last tour in 1919, and they were playing Boston. Well, okay, they were playing Boston, and his drummer, whom I'm convinced had PTSD, just thought that the conductor had looked at him funny, and during the intermission lunged at him with a knife, and so James Reese Europe told his assistant conductor, "Well, you take over the second half, and I'll see you in the morning." They took him to the hospital. And they said, "Well, we have to put you under anesthesia. Do you have anything you'd like to say before you go under?" And he said, "Well, that drummer, he didn't mean it. He's a good boy." And those are his last words. He died in the night, and the whole nation was devastated. There'd only been 2 recording sessions, one before the war and one after the war. So we don't have as many as we should have of recordings of the Harlem Hellfighters band. Eleanor Rhodeson had been an actress, but she married a millionaire. And then, as a millionaire's wife, she could afford to do good works. And she not only worked for the Red Cross, but she was the one who suggested that Winthrop Ames be sent to France to survey what kind of entertainment did the men need over there to keep up the troop morale. So they sent Winthrop Ames along with E.H. Southern, a famous actor, and they went around to where the Americans were camped or near the front lines. And at first, E.H. Southern did monologues from Shakespeare, and he wasn't getting much of a reaction. They discovered what they wanted was something upbeat and like about home and about women, and so they went home and made their report, and that led to the formation of the Over There Theater League. And this is kind of late in the war. I mean, the war was we were well underway, but George M. Cohan was a leader. He made a stirring speech at the organizational meeting, and in 1918, so a whole year after we had joined the war, and they filled the Palace Theater. And who's ready to go over and entertain the troops? I am. Every hand in the place went up. They all stood up. They wanted to go now. The trouble was they couldn't get boats to take them over. It took so long to get them over there, but they did organize, and what they decided was they would go over in five people units, because that's how many could fit in a flivver. A flivver was an early Ford, and so they would usually have a musician, or maybe it would be a driver and 4 actors, or something like that, or someone with a keyboard, and dozens of them went over. Craig was the first one. He didn't wait to be for the organization. He just found his way over on his own and did straight plays. But the whole story of the YMCA sponsored Over There Theater League is in this book, and it's really amazing what all they did. They had headquarters in Paris. One of the units sent Will Cressy. He had a rube act in vaudeville, kind of a folksy old guy, from the farm. And so he and his wife and a couple of others had a musician, and their 5-person unit was called Some Home Folks. And the reason I mention him of all of them was because he kept extensive journals and also sent newspaper reports of what he did, what it was like to entertain the troops over there, and a lot of photographs. So those materials are available in the New York Public Library, the Billy Rose Theater Collection. So that's Cressy and Dane, is with his wife, and they eventually retired to a farm in New York. So examples of his writing. And Margaret Mayo had a 5-person unit called the Gloom Chasers, later called the Shock Unit, and they did comedy. And so a lot of women went over in different capacities, and there were pageant things that would boost morale. There's a Joan of Arc pageant near where Joan of Arc was born. Nasa McLean was an illustrator, and she would go over and entertain by doing drawings. This is one of her posters that she designed. And we're almost to the end here. So this is a British a French equivalent of YMCA hut. YMCA built soldier huts at different points where there were a lot of soldiers stationed, and it was a place where they could go for rest and recreation, letter writing materials, and girls behind the counter, which meant a lot to see an old-fashioned American girl. Sometimes they were donut girls, and giving out donuts to the guys. And so there, in French, it was called Foyer des Soldats. So they could play checkers, and so they could have, sometimes there'd be a singer in the hut. And then Bernhardt predicted that with the intermarriage of French and Americans, French girls marrying American soldiers would create a master race. She loved the idea of that gene pool. But there were a lot of American women who went over and service and volunteered. Most of them at their own expense. Some. And here you see, and they had uniforms. The YMCA gave them uniforms. And then after armistice, there still were not enough boats to bring everybody home. The war was over, and you'd think you'd get to go home the next day, but no, it took a couple years to bring everybody home. It took until 1922 to get them all home. And I know because my grandfather was in Koblenz until 1922. At any rate, so while they were waiting, knowing, okay, there's no more fighting, I just want to go home. So what did they do? American entertainment to give them a taste of home. And YMCA did a lot of it. This is in Paris. That's an ice skating rink in Paris. It is a theater now. It was Jean-Louis Barrault's theater for a while. And Bordeaux was a famous rest and recreation area, so it had a really good YMCA. Did you know that Busby Berkeley got his start? You know who Busby Berkeley was, right?
Yes.
A choreographer in movies where you look down and you see the kaleidoscope of legs. 42nd Street with Ruby Keeler. Well, he learned that from it when he was a second lieutenant in France and organized marching drills, get them on the beat and doing it all at exactly the right. And then he also did balloon observation, so he was looking down on the patterns on the ground. And that was a kind of prelude. And by the way, his mother was Gertrude Berkeley, an actress, and for a while she had a company at the Folly Theater in Kansas City. So this is what a soldier show looked like, the women's roles played by men. And there were a lot of those during that couple years that it took to get everybody home. and jazz, of course, it was swept the nation. But Americans, they were getting, they were cutting up from. But the French loved Americans. They were grateful that they wouldn't have won the war without the Americans. But all these Americans on the loose, looking for entertainment, looking for the girls and the drink and then also just spending wildly. They had money and nothing to spend it on, so they raised the prices of everything. So the French began to resent the Americans. The French American love affair was starting to go bad. And here we see a cartoon about it, how Americans caused the raising of prices. So Eugène Brieux wrote a play called Americans Among Us, or Les Américains chez nous. And it was in a spirit of showing cross-cultural difficulties can be overcome. And so this is Act One. It's in the home of a country home near Dijon. It has no electricity. It never had electricity. There are references to the candle and the kerosene lamp in Act One. And this is out in their patio, I guess you'd call it, their terrace in Act Two. And the American is convincing them that he can bring happiness with electricity. And then Act Three, look at the devastation that electricity has wrought, and Taylorism, and the French getting all, no, this is not what we wanted. It's destroying our way of life. But it does end happily with a Franco-American marriage or two. So it's a good upbeat comedy at the end. You can now read it in English. Last month, my translation of it came out from Broadway Play Publishing. Welcome to take a look at it up here. It's not a great play, but I love it. and it tells us a lot about the times. And then the American great play, there were a lot of post-war plays about the war and the French influence, and even just normal comedies that little lines would creep in. Oh, those French people, they ate cheese with bugs in it, that kind of thing. But the great post-war play was What Price Glory by Maxwell Anderson and Lawrence Stallings. And that was famous because it used real soldier language. Language that had never before been spoken from the stage. Many people were horrified, but this was realistic for soldiers. So this play is very famous, and if you might recognize Louis Walheim, I always had students read this play when we got to the 20s, and it was made into a movie. I think it's been a couple of movies, but the first a silent film version. The silent film, you didn't have to hear the bad language. You had to imagine it. So finally getting home. And oh yes, I love that. How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? And after the war, many Americans did remain in France. That's an early cemetery. Americans in France. And World War II all over again. I know I took a lot of time.
You did it in an hour. We've never had 250 slides like this in an hour.
Worth every minute.
Right.
Yeah, questions.
So good.
I could have sat for another hour.
I could have
Thank
sat for
you.
another
Thank you.
2 hours.
Joke, singing.
And
Thinking
I
he
do have
could probably work.
PowerPoints on James
He used to
Rusure,
sing it.
Elsie Janis, Sarah Bernhardt, a lot of.
There has been, I know it was somebody did a documentary on the Harlan Helpline. I saw
Yes.
it last year. It was
Yes.
either on Smithsonian or History,
Right.
really good.
Yes.
And, who knew? I didn't know that they were the fighting group in the war. Everybody, you know, it's the way
Right.
we treat African Americans and forget what they did, then they come home and they're lynched.
Exactly,
I
yes.
mean, there were stories of soldiers. I mean, there's a famous one who was beaten up and blinded in North Carolina on the way home.
Oh, yes.
Terrible
Yes,
stuff.
Europe was in that. He was there in the North Carolina riots and trying to, you know, speaking reason to his men. But, you know, those things that just wasn't hard for it to get ignited. Yes.
So when it took so long to get everybody home, were the soldiers still living on a base of some sort?
Yes.
So the government was still supporting them while
Yeah.
they were there? Yeah.
Right.
Wow. It's a long time.
Yes, it is, yeah.
So Felicia, I remember I'd like to do cemeteries, as you know. And when I was in Greenwood a couple of years ago, I came across the grave of twin sisters who had gone to Europe and done their service as nurses. And on the way home, they both jumped off the boat. And it was just so sad. They obviously had PTSD of some sort.
Yes, which
Nobody
was
knew
not
it.
recognized then. You're
And,
just supposed to man up.
I mean, this is the crazy things I found wandering through cemeteries, but these are very sad. They were in their, like 21, 22.
But as you mentioned, there are a lot of videos available online. If you, you know, if you just Google Harlem Hellfighters or James Reese Europe or Anne Morgan in France, the Committee for Devastated Regions of France, there's wonderful silent footage. And then, of course, with James Reese Europe, there are documentaries where his recordings have been added to the silent footage. So you can find out a lot about them online.
Thank you, that was true.
Yeah, it really was.
It was fantastic.
Thank you.